Sometimes the dead refuse to stay silent, and sometimes love speaks loudest from beyond the grave. I'm Eleanor, and I've spent my entire life collecting letters that hold secrets powerful enough to topple kingdoms and destroy empires built on lies. 3 weeks ago, while cataloging estate donations at the Portland Maritime Museum, I found a wooden box wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with black wax, hidden inside the false bottom of an old sea captain's trunk that had been sitting in storage for over a century. When I carefully broke that seal, dozens of letters spilled out, each one marked with the same haunting symbol I had seen only once before in my years of historical preservation: a broken anchor crossed with a rose. These letters tell the most dangerous love story I have ever encountered, written by a man who was supposedly dead, addressed to a woman who was supposed to forget him, revealing secrets that powerful men had literally killed to protect. This is the true story of Charlotte Winslow and Nathaniel Hart, two lovers torn apart by forces beyond their control, and how letters written from a prison that should have been a grave became the weapon that brought down an entire network of corruption that had poisoned a town for decades. Have you ever received a message from someone you thought was lost forever? Have you discovered that everything you believed about someone's death was a carefully constructed lie? Share your story in the comments, because Charlotte's journey will show you that truth has a way of rising from even the deepest graves, and that love can survive anything when it's strong enough to speak from beyond the darkness. Camden, Maine, in the autumn of 1840, was a coastal town where the smell of salt and pine resin mixed in the crisp air that rolled off Penobscot Bay, where white church steeples pierced gray skies that threatened early snow, and where wooden houses with widows' walks stood sentinel over harbors filled with fishing boats and merchant vessels that connected this small community to the wider world of commerce and trade that sustained New England's economy. The town's main street ran parallel to the waterfront, lined with establishments that served both land and sea: the general store where wives bought fabric and flour, the chandlery where captains purchased rope and canvas, the bank where merchants deposited profits from successful voyages, and the tavern where sailors drank away their wages before ships carried them back to the dangerous waters that claimed lives with brutal regularity. Charlotte Winslow lived in a modest but well-maintained house on High Street, a 2-story colonial with dark green shutters and a small garden that she tended herself, surrounded by the kind of neat white picket fence that spoke of respectability and proper mourning for a widow who had lost her husband 3 years earlier to the same unforgiving ocean that provided Camden's livelihood. At 36 years old, Charlotte possessed a beauty that had survived grief and hardship, with dark hair that she wore pulled back in the severe style expected of widows, hazel eyes that held depths of emotion she had learned to conceal behind the mask of proper behavior, and a grace of movement that revealed the genteel upbringing she had received before circumstances had reduced her to the careful management of a modest inheritance that required her to live simply and avoid any behavior that might attract scandal or criticism from neighbors who watched widows carefully for signs of impropriety. The house on High Street had been purchased with the small settlement Charlotte had received after her husband Thomas Winslow's ship had gone down in a storm off the Grand Banks, taking with it not only Thomas but also the modest prosperity that his work as a ship's officer had provided for a marriage that had been more about practical necessity than passionate love. Charlotte's life as Thomas's wife had been quiet and unremarkable, marked by his long absences at sea and her solitary days managing their household and maintaining the social connections that were expected of a respectable merchant's wife, while the emotional distance between them had been something neither had acknowledged but both had understood as the price of a marriage that had been arranged by families more interested in property and propriety than in the compatibility or happiness of the couple being joined. The history that Charlotte carried in her heart but had never spoken aloud to anyone in Camden involved a love that had burned with an intensity that had frightened and transformed her during the years before her marriage to Thomas, When she had been young enough to believe that passion and happiness were possible and naive enough to think that society would allow her to choose a life partner based on love rather than family expectations and financial considerations. Nathaniel Hart had been everything that Charlotte's family had not wanted for her, the son of a shopkeeper rather than a merchant family, educated through his own efforts rather than through family resources, and possessed of ideals about justice and truth that had made him dangerous to people whose prosperity depended on looking the other way when convenient and maintaining silence about uncomfortable realities that threatened to disrupt the social order. The love affair between Charlotte Sinclair, as she had been known then, and Nathaniel Hart had been conducted in secret during the 2 years before her family had discovered the relationship and taken decisive action to end it, sending Charlotte to live with relatives in Boston while spreading rumors in Camden that Nathaniel had been involved in criminal activities that made him unsuitable as a marriage partner for any respectable young woman. Charlotte's forced separation from Nathaniel had been followed by her marriage to Thomas Winslow, a man chosen by her father specifically because his frequent absences at sea would prevent Charlotte from developing the kind of close relationship that might have allowed her to confide in him about her past and the love she had never stopped feeling for someone she had been told to forget. The disappearance of Nathaniel Hart from Camden had occurred shortly after Charlotte's marriage, with conflicting stories suggesting he had either left voluntarily to seek his fortune elsewhere or had met with some accident or foul play that had removed him permanently from the community where his presence had become inconvenient for people who had wanted to eliminate his influence and silence his questions about business practices and political arrangements that benefited the powerful at the expense of ordinary citizens. The official story that had gradually solidified claimed that Nathaniel had signed on to a merchant vessel bound for China and had been lost at sea when the ship had encountered a typhoon in the Pacific, though no body had ever been recovered and no definitive proof had ever been offered beyond the word of men whose reliability Charlotte had learned to question. Charlotte's years of widowhood had been marked by the kind of quiet respectability that protected her from gossip while also isolating her from meaningful connection with a community that viewed her with the mixture of sympathy and suspicion that was often directed at women whose circumstances placed them outside the normal patterns of family life and social obligation. Her days followed predictable routines of household management, occasional charitable work that was expected of women in her position, and the kind of reading and solitary reflection that filled hours that might otherwise have been consumed by the demands of children and family relationships that she had never been given the opportunity to create. The first letter had arrived on a September evening when fog from the bay had rolled through Camden's streets, creating the kind of thick gray blanket that muffled sound and transformed familiar landscapes into mysterious territories where anything might be hiding just beyond the limits of visibility. Charlotte had been preparing for bed when she had heard the soft knock at her front door, a sound so quiet that she had almost convinced herself she had imagined it until curiosity had compelled her to check and she had found the letter lying on her doorstep, sealed with black wax that bore the unmistakable image of a broken anchor crossed with a rose, the same symbol that Nathaniel had used on letters he had written to her during their courtship years ago. The shock of seeing that familiar symbol had been so powerful that Charlotte had stood in her doorway for several minutes, staring at the letter as though it might disappear if she looked away, while her mind had raced through explanations that ranged from cruel practical jokes to impossible resurrections of hopes she had thought were buried forever. The hour was well past midnight according to the clock in her parlor, and the fog had made it impossible to see whether anyone was still nearby who might have delivered this mysterious correspondence, leaving Charlotte alone with the letter and the decision of whether to open it or to destroy it unopened to protect herself from whatever pain or danger it might contain. Charlotte's decision to open the letter had been inevitable despite her fear of what it might reveal, as the possibility that Nathaniel might somehow still be alive had been too powerful to resist even though her rational mind had insisted that such hope was foolish and would lead only to greater pain when the truth behind this strange delivery was eventually revealed. The handwriting inside had been unmistakably Nathaniel's, with the distinctive slant and flourishes that Charlotte had memorized from reading his earlier letters so many times that she could have reproduced them from memory. And the content had been so shocking that Charlotte had been forced to sit down as her legs had threatened to give way beneath the weight of revelations that challenged everything she had believed about her community and the men who governed it. The letter had contained detailed accusations against 3 of Camden's most respected citizens, the bank president, the harbor master, and a prominent merchant who served on the town council, describing a conspiracy of fraud and corruption that had enriched these men through schemes involving false insurance claims on ships that had been deliberately destroyed, embezzlement of funds intended for harbor improvements, and bribery of officials who might otherwise have investigated irregularities in financial records and shipping documents. The specificity of the accusations had been striking, with exact dates, amounts, and methods described in language that suggested the writer had direct knowledge of these crimes rather than relying on speculation or hearsay. But even more shocking than the accusations themselves had been the closing paragraphs of the letter, where Nathaniel had explained that he was writing from a place of imprisonment, that he had discovered these crimes years earlier while working as a clerk for the very men he was now accusing, and that his attempts to expose their corruption had resulted in his own false imprisonment on charges that had been manufactured to silence him and to ensure that his accusations would never be heard by anyone with the authority or will to investigate them properly. Nathaniel's explanation of how he had maintained the ability to write and send letters despite his captivity had been vague, suggesting only that he had cultivated relationships with people who had access to the outside world and who were willing to help him for reasons of their own. The final lines of the letter had been addressed directly to Charlotte in language that had made clear the writer's intimate knowledge of their shared history and his continued feelings for someone he had never stopped loving despite the years of separation and the marriage that had placed her beyond his reach. "My dearest Charlotte," Nathaniel had written, "I know that receiving this letter will bring you pain and confusion, and I know that I have no right to disturb the peace you have built in your life without me. But the sins of these men have destroyed too many lives, and their continued power to harm others must be stopped by someone who has the courage and the standing to bring their crimes into the light. I am sending you these letters not to burden you with my suffering, but to give you the weapon you need to achieve the justice that I can no longer pursue myself. Trust nothing that you have been told about my disappearance, and trust no one who speaks with certainty about my fate. The truth is far darker than anyone in Camden has been willing to admit, and bringing it to light will require courage that may cost you everything you have built since we were forced apart." Charlotte's initial reaction to the letter had been a mixture of emotions so complex and contradictory that she had spent the entire night sitting in her parlor, reading and rereading Nathaniel's words while trying to determine whether they represented truth or some elaborate deception designed to manipulate her for purposes she could not yet understand. The possibility that Nathaniel was still alive but imprisoned had filled her with simultaneous joy at his survival and horror at the thought of the suffering he must have endured for years while she had been living her quiet life in Camden, believing him to be dead and trying to forget the love that had once defined her existence. The question of what to do with the letter and the information it contained had occupied Charlotte's thoughts during the sleepless hours before dawn, as she had understood that acting on Nathaniel's accusations would require her to challenge men whose power and influence in Camden were considerable and who would certainly retaliate against anyone who threatened to expose their crimes. The safer course would have been to destroy the letter and pretend she had never received it, protecting herself from the danger and scandal that would certainly follow if she became involved in efforts to expose corruption among the town's leadership. But the memory of her love for Nathaniel and the thought of him suffering in prison while she remained silent about crimes that could be proven if she had the courage to pursue the truth had made it impossible for Charlotte to consider simply ignoring his plea for help and justice. The possibility that she might be able to contribute to his rescue or at least to the exposure of the men responsible for his imprisonment had given her a sense of purpose that had been missing from her life since Thomas's death, while the chance to finally act on feelings that she had been forced to suppress for so many years had reawakened parts of her spirit that had been dormant during the long years of her marriage and widowhood. The second letter had arrived exactly 1 week after the first, delivered in the same mysterious manner at midnight and sealed with the same black wax symbol that had become both familiar and ominous in its implications about the elaborate system that must exist to allow a prisoner to correspond with the outside world. This second letter had contained equally detailed accusations against different members of Camden's establishment, including a lawyer who had manipulated probate proceedings to defraud widows and orphans of their inheritances, a shipowner who had knowingly sent vessels to sea in unsafe conditions to collect insurance money when they inevitably sank, and a minister who had used his position to cover up the crimes of wealthy parishioners in exchange for generous donations to the church. The pattern that had emerged from these first 2 letters had suggested that Nathaniel's knowledge of Camden's corruption was comprehensive and systematic rather than limited to isolated incidents, and that the network of criminal activity he was exposing involved most of the men who held positions of authority and respect in the community. Charlotte's growing understanding of the scope of this conspiracy had been accompanied by increasing fear about the dangers she would face if she attempted to use this information to seek justice, as men who had already resorted to false imprisonment and possibly murder to protect their secrets would certainly be willing to harm or kill a widow who threatened to expose them. The third letter had arrived 2 weeks after the second, breaking the weekly pattern that Charlotte had begun to expect and creating anxiety about whether something had happened to prevent Nathaniel from continuing his correspondence. This letter had been different in tone and content from the earlier ones, containing not accusations of crimes but rather personal reflections on the years they had been apart and Nathaniel's regret about the choices that had led to their separation and his subsequent imprisonment. His writing had revealed a man who had been broken by suffering but who had maintained his essential character and his commitment to principles that had guided his life even when acting on those principles had cost him his freedom. Charlotte, this third letter had begun, "Forgive me for bringing darkness into your life after you have worked so hard to find peace and respectability in a world that offers women so few opportunities for either. I have spent countless hours in my captivity thinking about the moment when I failed you, when I chose to pursue justice against powerful men rather than accepting their corruption and building a quiet life with you. I believed then that a man who lacked the courage to stand for truth was not worthy of your love, but I have learned through suffering that pride in one's principles is cold comfort when it costs us everything we value most. I am sending you these letters not because I expect or deserve your help, but because I have nothing left to lose and no other way to strike back at the men who destroyed my life and who continue to harm others with impunity. Whatever you decide to do with the information I am providing, know that you have always been my first thought and my last, and that no amount of suffering could make me regret the love we shared even though it ended in pain for both of us." Charlotte's emotional response to this more personal letter had been profound, reawakening feelings that she had tried to bury but which had never truly died despite the years and the marriage that had separated her from the man who had been her true love. The realization that Nathaniel had maintained his feelings for her throughout his imprisonment had been both comforting and devastating, as it had confirmed that their connection had been real and lasting while also highlighting the tragedy of wasted years and lost opportunities that could never be recovered even if he were somehow freed from whatever prison held him. The decision about how to proceed with the letters and their accusations had become increasingly urgent as Charlotte had understood that remaining passive was itself a choice that would have consequences for Nathaniel and for all the other people who had been victimized by the corruption he was exposing. The challenge had been determining how to act effectively without putting herself in immediate danger from men who had already proven their willingness to eliminate threats to their criminal enterprises. Charlotte's initial inquiries about the possibility of Nathaniel's survival had been conducted carefully and indirectly, asking casual questions of longtime residents about what they remembered of his disappearance and listening carefully for inconsistencies or signs that the official story might be questioned by people who had known him and who might have doubts about whether he had truly left town voluntarily or died at sea as claimed. These conversations had yielded frustratingly little useful information, as most people either claimed to have no memory of the events surrounding Nathaniel's departure or repeated versions of the official story that seemed designed to discourage further inquiry. The fourth letter had arrived 3 weeks after the third, containing accusations so explosive that Charlotte had understood why Nathaniel had saved them for later in his correspondence, after establishing the pattern of corruption and preparing her to believe claims that might otherwise have seemed too outrageous to credit. This letter had detailed a conspiracy involving the deliberate wrecking of ships on the treacherous rocks near Camden's harbor, with false signals being used to lure vessels into danger so that their cargoes could be salvaged and sold by the same men who had caused the wrecks, while insurance claims were filed to cover losses that had actually enriched the conspirators rather than harming them. The revelation that some of Camden's prosperity had been built on such deliberate destruction and loss of life had been sickening for Charlotte, as she had realized that ships going down in what had been reported as accidents or unfortunate encounters with dangerous coastlines had actually been victims of criminal acts that had killed sailors and passengers while enriching the men responsible for their deaths. The specific details that Nathaniel had provided about particular wrecks, including the names of ships and dates of incidents, had given Charlotte information that could potentially be verified through research into shipping records and newspaper accounts if she could find a way to conduct such investigation without alerting the men being accused. The change in how Charlotte was being treated by certain members of Camden society had begun subtly after the second or third letter, with small shifts in behavior that might have been coincidental but which gradually formed a pattern suggesting that someone was aware of her correspondence with Nathaniel and was taking steps to monitor her activities and limit her ability to act on the information she was receiving. Invitations to social gatherings that she would normally have received had stopped coming, conversations that would have been friendly had become strained and formal, and she had noticed people watching her with expressions that suggested suspicion rather than the sympathy and respect that had previously characterized how she was treated as a respectable widow. The realization that she was being observed and potentially in danger had forced Charlotte to become more cautious in her daily activities while also making her more determined to find ways to expose the corruption that Nathaniel was revealing, as the attempt to intimidate her through social isolation and surveillance had confirmed that the men being accused recognized the threat she represented and were taking active measures to neutralize her before she could do serious damage to their interests. The challenge had become finding ways to gather additional evidence and identify potential allies while avoiding behavior that might provoke more direct action from people who had already demonstrated their willingness to use violence and false imprisonment to protect their secrets. The fifth letter arrived during the first week of November when ice had begun forming along the edges of Penobscot Bay and early darkness came with a severity that made Camden feel isolated from the rest of the world, as though the approaching winter was creating walls around the community that would prevent truth from escaping or justice from entering. Charlotte had been expecting this letter with a mixture of anticipation and dread, understanding that each new revelation brought her closer to a confrontation with forces that had already destroyed one life and would not hesitate to destroy another if their continued prosperity and reputation depended on maintaining the silence that protected their crimes. This fifth letter had been the longest yet, running to several pages written in Nathaniel's increasingly desperate hand, the writing itself revealing the deteriorating physical and mental condition of someone who understood that time was running out and that the opportunity to achieve justice was narrowing with each passing day. The content of this letter had focused not on new accusations but rather on providing Charlotte with specific guidance about where to find documentary evidence that could corroborate the claims made in earlier letters, including the location of financial records that had been hidden rather than destroyed, the names of witnesses who had been paid to remain silent but who might be persuaded to speak if guaranteed protection, and the details of how the conspiracy maintained its power through a network of mutual blackmail that ensured no member would betray the others without bringing destruction upon himself. Charlotte, my beloved, this letter had begun with an intimacy that suggested Nathaniel understood he might not have many more opportunities to communicate with her. I have spent the last weeks preparing this information because I know that accusations alone will not be sufficient to bring down men who have spent years building their defenses against exposure. You will need proof that can withstand legal scrutiny and social pressure, and you will need allies who understand that remaining silent has become more dangerous than speaking truth. The documents I am directing you toward are hidden in places where the guilty men believed they would never be found, but I learned their locations during my time working in their offices before they understood that I was a threat to them. The specific locations that Nathaniel had described in his letter had included a false bottom in a filing cabinet in the harbor master's office where records of payoffs to officials were kept, a locked box buried beneath the foundation of the bank building that contained evidence of embezzled funds and false accounting, and a set of ledgers hidden in the attic of the merchant's warehouse that documented profits from illegal activities including smuggling and the sale of salvaged cargo from deliberately wrecked ships. The detailed nature of these instructions had suggested that Nathaniel had been planning his eventual exposure of these crimes long before his imprisonment, gathering information systematically and hiding copies in locations where they would be preserved even if he were unable to personally deliver them to authorities who might act on them. But the most striking element of this fifth letter had been Nathaniel's explicit warning that Charlotte herself was in immediate danger, that the men being accused had become aware of his correspondence with her and were planning to neutralize her before she could use the information she had received to damage their interests or credibility. "They are watching you now," Nathaniel had written, "and they are waiting for an opportunity to silence you in a way that will not create suspicion or questions about their involvement. Do not trust anyone who offers you assistance or sympathy without being asked, and do not assume that isolation will protect you from harm. These men have proven their willingness to commit any crime necessary to preserve their power, and they will not allow sentiment or respect for propriety to prevent them from eliminating a threat that you now represent." Charlotte's reading of this warning had been accompanied by the sound of footsteps on the street outside her house, a sound that might have been innocent but which had taken on sinister significance in the context of Nathaniel's message about surveillance and planned violence. The fear that had gripped Charlotte as she had extinguished her lamp and moved to a window where she could observe without being seen had been unlike anything she had experienced during her previous life of sheltered security, a visceral understanding that she had entered a situation where her safety and survival could not be taken for granted and where every interaction and decision carried potentially deadly consequences. The figure that Charlotte had observed through her window had been Samuel Hutchins, the bank president whose name had appeared in the first letter as one of the principal conspirators in the network of fraud and corruption that Nathaniel had been exposing. Hutchins was a man in his 50s who had cultivated an image of respectable prosperity and civic responsibility, serving on multiple committees and boards while also maintaining his position as one of Camden's most trusted financial authorities, someone to whom widows and other vulnerable people brought their money believing it would be managed honestly and safely. His presence outside Charlotte's house at such a late hour had been disturbing not only because it confirmed that she was indeed being watched but also because it suggested that the conspirators were becoming more bold and desperate in their surveillance. The departure of Hutchins after several minutes of standing in the shadows across from Charlotte's house had been followed by her decision to act immediately on Nathaniel's instructions about gathering documentary evidence before the conspirators could discover that she knew where it was hidden and take steps to destroy it. The risk of leaving her house at night to break into offices and warehouses where the evidence was supposedly located had been considerable, but Charlotte had understood that delay would only allow the conspiracy more time to prepare defenses and to eliminate both evidence and witnesses who might support accusations against them. Charlotte's preparation for her mission to gather evidence had been careful and thorough despite the urgency she felt, as she had understood that being caught in the act of breaking into buildings would provide the conspirators with a perfect excuse to have her arrested or committed to an asylum as mentally unstable, eliminating her credibility while also removing her ability to share the information she had received from Nathaniel. She had dressed in dark clothing that would make her less visible during her nocturnal activities, had gathered tools that might be needed to open locked doors or containers, and had created a plan for retrieving documents from multiple locations in a single night before the pattern of break-ins could be recognized and security could be increased. The first location on Charlotte's list had been the harbor master's office, a wooden building near the waterfront that served as headquarters for the official who regulated shipping traffic and collected fees from vessels using Camden's port facilities. The building was typically locked and empty at night, making it relatively easy for someone with determination and basic tools to gain access, though the risk of being observed by late-night workers on the docks or sailors returning from the tavern had required Charlotte to approach carefully and to work quickly once inside to minimize the time when she might be discovered. The filing cabinet that Nathaniel had described in his letter had been exactly where he had indicated, positioned against the wall of the main office in a location that would not normally attract particular attention from anyone who had legitimate business in the building. The false bottom that Charlotte discovered after removing the drawer and examining its underside had been sophisticated enough that it might never have been found by someone who was not specifically looking for it, concealing a space approximately 3 inches deep that contained several notebooks and loose papers that appeared to document financial transactions between the harbor master and various ship captains who had been paying bribes to avoid inspections or to receive favorable treatment. In the allocation of docking spaces and loading priorities, Charlotte's careful removal of these documents and her equally careful restoration of the filing cabinet to its original appearance had been accomplished quickly and efficiently, demonstrating capabilities that she had not known she possessed until circumstances had required her to develop them. The discovery that she was capable of such bold action had been both empowering and unsettling, revealing parts of her character that had remained dormant during her years of conventional respectability but which were now emerging in response to the challenges and dangers she faced in her efforts to help Nathaniel and to expose the corruption that had poisoned Camden for far too long. The second location had been more challenging because it required Charlotte to access the bank building, a structure that was located on Main Street where any unusual activity would be more likely to be noticed by residents or by the night watchmen who made regular rounds through the business district. The instructions Nathaniel had provided about the location of the locked box beneath the bank's foundation had required Charlotte to access the building's cellar through an exterior entrance that was typically secured with a heavy padlock but which she was able to open using tools she had brought for precisely this purpose. The cellar of the bank building had been dark and damp, filled with old furniture and discarded equipment that created shadows and obstacles that made navigation difficult even with the small lantern that Charlotte had brought to provide minimal illumination for her search. The area of the foundation that Nathaniel had described as containing the hidden box had required Charlotte to move several heavy objects and to dig through loose dirt that had apparently been disturbed previously when the box was buried, demonstrating that someone had indeed created the hiding place exactly as Nathaniel had claimed in his letter. The locked box that Charlotte had finally uncovered after 30 minutes of difficult excavation had been made of heavy metal and had been secured with a lock that had proven more resistant to her efforts than the simple padlock on the cellar entrance. Her eventual decision to simply take the entire box rather than continuing to struggle with the lock had been motivated partly by concern about the time she was spending in a location where discovery would be disastrous and partly by recognition that the contents might be better examined in the safety and light of her own home rather than in the dark cellar where she might miss important details or damage fragile documents. The third location had been the merchant's warehouse, a large building near the waterfront that served as storage for goods being loaded onto ships or waiting to be sold to local retailers and consumers. The attic space that Nathaniel had identified as containing hidden ledgers had been accessible through an external stairway that was used primarily for ventilation and emergency egress, providing Charlotte with a way to reach the target location without passing through the main floors of the warehouse where night watchmen maintained irregular patrols to discourage theft of valuable merchandise. The attic of the warehouse had been even more challenging to search than the bank cellar, as it was filled with decades of accumulated debris and discarded materials that created a maze of obstacles while also providing numerous potential hiding places for documents that someone wanted to conceal but not destroy. The specific location that Nathaniel had described in his letter had been behind a false wall that had been constructed in a corner of the attic, creating a space approximately 2 feet deep that contained several large ledgers and numerous folders of correspondence that appeared to document the full scope of the merchant's illegal activities, including smuggling, false insurance claims, and the deliberate wrecking of ships to allow profitable salvage of their cargoes. Charlotte's collection of these materials and her careful exit from the warehouse had been accomplished without incident, though the physical and emotional demands of her night of document gathering had left her exhausted and shaken by the time she had returned to her own house with her discoveries safely hidden in locations where they would not be found by anyone who might search her home looking for evidence of her illegal activities. The realization that she had successfully gathered documentary proof of the conspiracy's crimes had been accompanied by understanding that she now possessed materials that would make her an even greater target for men who would stop at nothing to prevent their exposure. The examination of the documents that Charlotte had gathered had required several days of careful study, as the materials included financial records, correspondence, and other information that needed to be understood in context before their significance could be fully appreciated. The notebooks from the harbor master's office had contained detailed records of bribes paid by ship captains and merchants in exchange for favorable treatment, while the locked box from the bank had yielded evidence of systematic embezzlement and manipulation of accounts that demonstrated how Samuel Hutchins had been stealing from depositors while maintaining the appearance of scrupulous honesty in his public role. The ledgers and correspondence from the warehouse had been perhaps the most damning materials, as they had included explicit discussions of plans to cause shipwrecks through false signals and disabled navigational aids, along with detailed accounts of profits that had been generated through the sale of salvaged cargoes that were supposed to have been lost at sea. The casual tone of these discussions and the complete absence of any moral concern about the deaths that had been caused by these deliberate wrecks had been chilling evidence of how thoroughly corrupted these men had become in their pursuit of profit and power without regard for the human cost of their criminal enterprises. The question of what to do with this evidence had occupied Charlotte's thoughts constantly during the days following her successful gathering of materials, as she had understood that simply possessing proof of crimes was not the same as being able to use it effectively to achieve justice and protect herself from retaliation. The challenge had been identifying authorities who would be willing and able to act on the evidence she could provide, while also ensuring that she would survive long enough to testify and to see that appropriate consequences were imposed on men who had spent years believing themselves to be above the law. The 6th letter had arrived 2 weeks after the 5th, delivered as always at midnight by methods that remained mysterious despite Charlotte's attempts to observe who was responsible for placing the letters at her door. This letter had contained Nathaniel's response to information he had somehow received about Charlotte's successful gathering of documentary evidence, confirming that he had access to news about external events despite his imprisonment and suggesting that his network of communication was more extensive than Charlotte had understood from his earlier letters. My dearest and bravest Charlotte, this letter had begun, I have learned of your remarkable courage in acting on my instructions to gather the evidence we need to expose these criminals and bring them to justice. Your success has given me hope that I have not felt in many years, while also increasing my fear for your safety as you have now made yourself an even greater threat to men who will not hesitate to harm you if they perceive you as a serious danger to their interests. I am writing to provide you with additional guidance about how to proceed from this point, including the identification of authorities who can be trusted to act on the evidence you have gathered and the strategy for protecting yourself while this evidence is being evaluated and used to build legal cases against the guilty men. The specific instructions that Nathaniel had provided in this letter had included the name of a federal marshal named Jonathan Barrett who had been conducting investigations into corruption in Maine's coastal towns and who would have both the authority and the motivation to pursue cases against men whose criminal activities extended beyond local jurisdiction to include violations of federal maritime and customs laws. Nathaniel's suggestion that Charlotte should contact Marshal Barrett directly rather than trying to work through local authorities who might be compromised or intimidated by the conspiracy had been accompanied by detailed information about how to reach this official and what evidence would be most useful in supporting his investigations. But the most important element of this sixth letter had been Nathaniel's revelation about his own location and the circumstances of his imprisonment. Information he had previously withheld either because he believed it would endanger Charlotte to know or because he had not yet decided whether exposing this information was worth the risk it would create. I am being held, Nathaniel had written, in a place that officially does not exist, a private prison maintained by the conspirators to confine people who have become inconvenient threats to their interests but whose deaths might create unwanted attention or investigation. This place is located on an island in the bay, close enough to Camden that supplies can be delivered regularly but far enough from regular shipping routes that it attracts no attention from people who might question why a building exists in such an isolated location. The revelation that Nathaniel had been imprisoned for years on an island that Charlotte could probably see from Camden's waterfront had been devastating in its implications about how thoroughly the conspiracy had penetrated local society and how completely they had subverted normal legal processes to serve their criminal purposes. The existence of a private prison that operated without any oversight or official recognition had demonstrated that these men had created their own system of justice and punishment that existed entirely outside the legal framework that was supposed to govern such matters, allowing them to eliminate threats without the inconvenience of trials or the risk that prisoners might eventually be released to testify against them. Nathaniel's description of the conditions in this prison and the other people who had been confined there had revealed that Charlotte's lover had survived years of treatment that would have broken most people, including physical deprivation, psychological torture, and the complete isolation from normal human contact that was designed to destroy prisoners' ability to remember or communicate effectively even if they were somehow freed. The fact that Nathaniel had maintained his mental clarity and his ability to write coherent and detailed letters despite these conditions had been testimony to strength of character that Charlotte had always recognized in him but which had been tested in ways she could never have imagined during their brief courtship years ago. The instructions that Nathaniel had provided about how Charlotte should proceed in contacting Marshal Barrett and providing him with the evidence she had gathered had been specific and practical, reflecting Nathaniel's understanding of how legal investigations worked and what would be required to build cases strong enough to overcome the defenses that the conspirators would certainly mount when they were finally confronted with accusations supported by documentary evidence. Charlotte's preparation for this meeting had required careful thought about how to present information in ways that would be convincing while also protecting her own safety and ensuring that she would not be easily dismissed as a hysterical widow or someone with personal motivations that might compromise her credibility as a witness. The journey to Portland to meet with Marshall Barrett had been Charlotte's first significant travel since her marriage years ago, requiring her to make arrangements for the security of her house and the protection of the evidence she had gathered, while also creating a cover story that would explain her absence to neighbors who were certainly monitoring her activities on behalf of the conspirators. The official reason she had given for her trip had been a need to visit a relative who was ill, a lie that had made Charlotte uncomfortable but which had seemed necessary to prevent the conspirators from understanding what she was actually planning until it was too late for them to prevent her from reaching federal authorities. Marshal Jonathan Barrett had been a man in his early 40s whose appearance and manner had immediately inspired confidence that he was someone who could be trusted to handle sensitive information appropriately and to take action against powerful criminals even when such action might create political or social complications. His immediate interest in the evidence that Charlotte had brought and his obvious skill in evaluating the legal significance of documents that might appear meaningless to someone without expertise in financial fraud had confirmed that Nathaniel's recommendation of this particular official had been well-founded and that Charlotte had not taken the risk of this meeting without good reason. The conversation between Charlotte and Marshall Barrett had extended over several hours as she had shared not only the physical evidence she had gathered but also the full story of Nathaniel's letters and the accusations they had contained about the scope and nature of corruption in Camden. Barrett's questions had been probing and intelligent, designed to assess both the reliability of the information and Charlotte's own motivations and credibility, while his responses had indicated that he was already aware of some problems in Camden and that her information fit with patterns he had been observing in his broader investigation of maritime corruption along the Maine coast. The outcome of this meeting had been Barrett's commitment to launch a formal investigation into the allegations Charlotte had presented, with the understanding that such an investigation would require time to gather additional evidence and to build cases that would stand up in court against defendants who would hire skilled lawyers and would attempt to use their influence to derail proceedings. Barrett's promise to provide protection for Charlotte during this investigation had been accompanied by his frank assessment that she would face significant dangers as word of the federal investigation became known and the conspirators realized that their exposure was imminent and that their only hope of avoiding prosecution would be to eliminate witnesses who could testify against them. The return journey from Portland to Camden had been marked by Charlotte's mixture of satisfaction at having successfully delivered evidence to someone who could act on it and apprehension about the confrontation that was now inevitable as the conspiracy's members learned that their crimes were being investigated by federal authorities who could not be intimidated or bribed as easily as local officials. The decision about whether to remain in Camden during the investigation or to seek temporary refuge elsewhere until the danger had passed had been difficult, as Charlotte had understood that leaving might appear to be an admission of guilt or fear that could be used against her, while remaining would expose her to threats from men who had already proven their willingness to commit violence to protect their interests. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is trust that the truth we've discovered will set others free, even when speaking that truth puts our own lives at risk. Charlotte didn't just read those letters, she became Nathaniel's voice, his hands, his hope for justice when he had nothing left but words written in darkness. Her midnight missions to gather evidence showed us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but rather the choice to act despite terror that threatens to paralyze us. If you've ever had to choose between your safety and doing what's right, or if you found strength you never knew you had when someone you loved needed you to be brave, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. These stories of everyday heroism remind us that we all have more courage than we think we do, and that love can make us stronger than any force that tries to silence truth. The seventh letter arrived on a December evening when freezing rain had made Camden's streets treacherous and had driven most residents indoors to their fires and families, creating the kind of isolation that made Charlotte acutely aware of her vulnerability as a woman living alone in a house that offered little protection against men who were determined to silence her before she could testify about their crimes. This letter had been different from all the previous ones in ways that had been immediately apparent even before Charlotte had broken the black wax seal, as the paper had been dampened and stained in ways that suggested it had been written and sent under circumstances even more difficult than those that had produced the earlier correspondence. Nathaniel's handwriting in this seventh letter had shown signs of physical deterioration that had suggested his health was failing under the strain of prolonged imprisonment and the harsh conditions he had endured for years without adequate food, medical care, or the basic human contact that was necessary for maintaining physical and mental well-being. The tremor in his script and the occasional gaps where his pen had apparently faltered had been more eloquent than words in conveying the suffering he was experiencing while simultaneously trying to provide Charlotte with the final pieces of information and guidance she would need to survive the confrontation that was rapidly approaching. My dearest Charlotte, this letter had begun with obvious difficulty. I write to you now knowing that this may be my last opportunity to communicate before circumstances prevent me from continuing our correspondence or before I lack the physical strength to hold a pen and form the words that must be said while I still have time. The men who hold me prisoner have become aware that I have been sending letters to the outside world, and they are taking measures to discover how this has been possible and to prevent any future communications that might threaten their security. I am writing to warn you that they know you have contacted federal authorities and that they are planning to take action against you before Marshal Barrett can complete his investigation and issue warrants for their arrest. The specific warning that Nathaniel had provided about the conspiracy's plans for Charlotte had been chilling in its details, as he had described conversations he had overheard between his guards discussing the various methods that were being considered for eliminating her as a witness while creating the appearance of an accident or natural death that would not attract the kind of scrutiny that an obvious murder might provoke. The options that had been discussed had included staging a house fire that would destroy both Charlotte and any evidence she might have hidden in her home, arranging a fatal accident during one of her walks along the cliffs overlooking the bay, or having her committed to an asylum on false claims of mental instability that would discredit anything she might say about corruption in Camden. But the most important element of this seventh letter had been Nathaniel's revelation about the identity of the person who had been helping him send letters from his island prison despite the conspiracy's efforts to maintain his complete isolation from the outside world. This helper had been revealed as Thomas Winslow, Charlotte's late husband, whose death at sea had not been the tragic accident that everyone had believed but rather a murder orchestrated by the same men who had imprisoned Nathaniel when Thomas had discovered their conspiracy and threatened to expose it. The shocking revelation that Charlotte's own husband had been involved in trying to fight the corruption that had infected Camden and that his death had been punishment for this courage rather than the result of natural maritime dangers had transformed Charlotte's understanding of her marriage and her late husband's character. I must tell you now what I have kept from you in earlier letters, Nathaniel had written, because you deserve to know the truth about Thomas and the sacrifice he made trying to protect you and to expose the men who had destroyed our chance for happiness together. Thomas came to see me in my prison cell several years ago, having discovered where I was being held through his own investigation into suspicious shipping accidents that he suspected were not truly accidental. He told me that he had always known about our love and that he had agreed to marry you at your family's insistence while understanding that he could never truly win your heart because it would always belong to someone else. He said he had been content with this arrangement because he respected you and believed he could provide you with the security and respectability that I had been unable to offer, but that he had recently discovered that the same men who had destroyed our happiness were continuing to harm innocent people and that he could not remain silent about their crimes. The detailed account that Nathaniel had provided about his conversations with Thomas had revealed that Charlotte's late husband had been a man of far greater depth and moral courage than she had understood during their marriage, and that his frequent absences at sea had been partly motivated by his investigations into the conspiracy rather than simply by the demands of his profession. Thomas had been gathering evidence similar to what Charlotte had recently collected, and he had been planning to present this evidence to authorities when the conspirators had discovered his activities and had arranged for his ship to encounter a storm that had supposedly claimed his life along with those of his crew members who had been innocent victims of a murder disguised as a maritime disaster. Thomas made me promise, Nathaniel had continued, that if anything happened to him, I would find a way to communicate with you and to give you the information and evidence necessary to complete the work he had started. He said that you deserved to know the truth about why he had died and to have the opportunity to achieve the justice that he would no longer be able to pursue. He also told me that he hoped exposing these criminals might somehow make amends for the happiness he had taken from us by agreeing to a marriage that had been based on your family's manipulation rather than on your own free choice. The revelation that Thomas had been the one responsible for establishing the network of communication that had allowed Nathaniel to send letters from his island prison had explained many of the mysteries that had surrounded the midnight deliveries and the sophisticated system that had maintained correspondence despite the conspiracy's efforts to keep Nathaniel isolated. Thomas had cultivated relationships with fishermen and other maritime workers who made regular trips past the island where Nathaniel was imprisoned, creating a chain of trusted intermediaries who could carry letters back and forth without being discovered by the conspirators who believed their private prison was completely secure from outside contact or interference. Charlotte's emotional response to these revelations about Thomas's character and his death had been profound and complicated, as she had been forced to reconsider her entire marriage and to recognize that she had been living with a man whose true nature and activities she had never fully understood or appreciated. The guilt she felt about having failed to love Thomas as he had deserved while he had been protecting her and trying to continue the fight against corruption that had destroyed her relationship with Nathaniel had been accompanied by grief for the loss of someone who had proven himself worthy of far more respect and affection than she had given him during their years together. The practical implications of learning that Thomas had been murdered rather than killed in an accident had also been significant, as Charlotte had realized that the same men who had killed her husband would certainly not hesitate to kill her now that she was continuing his work and threatening to expose crimes that had already cost multiple lives to protect. The decision about how to proceed in the face of this explicit threat had required Charlotte to balance her desire for justice and her love for Nathaniel against her very reasonable fear of men who had proven their willingness to commit murder to preserve their power and secrets. The 8th letter had arrived only 3 days after the 7th, breaking all previous patterns and suggesting that Nathaniel had felt urgent need to communicate additional information before circumstances made further correspondence impossible. This letter had been even more difficult to read than the previous one, with handwriting that had deteriorated to the point where some words were barely legible and several passages had been crossed out and rewritten as though Nathaniel had been struggling to maintain coherence while dealing with physical pain or weakness that was interfering with his ability to think and write clearly. The content of this 8th letter had focused on providing Charlotte with detailed instructions about how to locate and access the island prison where Nathaniel was being held, information that he had previously withheld either because he believed it would be too dangerous for her to know or because he had not yet decided whether revealing this information was wise given the risks it would create. The description of the island's location, the security measures that protected the prison building, and the schedule of guards and supply deliveries had been provided in language that suggested Nathaniel believed Charlotte might attempt a rescue or at least might need to direct Marshal Barrett's forces to the correct location when the time came for federal intervention. The island lies 3 miles northeast of Camden Harbor, Nathaniel had written, in a location that appears on most charts as uninhabited rock suitable only for nesting seabirds and occasional shelter for fishing vessels caught in bad weather. The building that serves as our prison was constructed to resemble a lighthouse keeper's dwelling, providing plausible explanation for any smoke or activity that might be observed from passing ships. There are typically 3 guards on duty at any time, with supplies delivered every 2 weeks by a boat that arrives after dark to avoid attracting attention from fishermen or others who might wonder why regular deliveries are being made to an allegedly abandoned structure. The revelation that there were other prisoners being held in this illegal facility besides Nathaniel had been accompanied by his request that Charlotte ensure any rescue or raid would free all of those being held rather than focusing solely on him, demonstrating that even after years of suffering he retained the concern for others and commitment to justice that had originally led to his imprisonment. The descriptions of these other prisoners and the reasons for their confinement had revealed that the conspiracy's reach extended far beyond Camden and included people from other communities who had threatened to expose corruption or who had possessed information that made them dangerous to powerful interests throughout coastal Maine. Charlotte's struggle with the question of what to do with this information about the prison's location had been intense and immediate, as she had understood that sharing it with Marshal Barrett could lead to Nathaniel's rescue but might also trigger a violent confrontation that could cost lives on both sides while potentially allowing the conspirators to destroy evidence or escape before they could be arrested and prosecuted. The alternative of attempting her own rescue mission had been appealing in its directness but unrealistic given her lack of resources, weapons, or experience with the kind of operation that would be required to overcome armed guards and free prisoners from a secure facility. The 9th letter had arrived 1 week after the 8th, delivered during a blizzard that had made travel through Camden's streets nearly impossible and which had suggested that whoever was responsible for delivering Nathaniel's letters possessed remarkable dedication to maintaining the communication system despite increasingly difficult conditions. This letter had contained Nathaniel's final instructions and what amounted to his farewell message to Charlotte, written in language that suggested he believed he would not survive much longer and that he wanted to ensure she understood his feelings and his wishes about how she should proceed after his death. My beloved Charlotte, this letter had begun, I am writing to you now knowing that my time is nearly over and that I will not live to see the justice we have worked toward or to hold you again in the embrace that has been denied to us for so many years. The guards have discovered my method of sending letters and have taken measures to ensure I will not be able to continue this correspondence, while my physical condition has deteriorated to the point where I am not certain I would be able to write again even if the opportunity presented itself. I am using what may be my last opportunity to put pen to paper to tell you things that should have been said years ago but which circumstances prevented us from sharing when we might have had the chance to build a life together. The personal reflections that had filled most of this 9th letter had been both beautiful and heartbreaking, as Nathaniel had shared memories of their courtship and expressions of love that had survived years of separation and suffering, while also providing Charlotte with permission to move forward with her life after his death without feeling guilty about finding happiness or love with someone else who might be able to give her the companionship and security that he had been unable to provide. His insistence that his greatest wish was for her happiness rather than for her continued mourning of what they had lost had been characteristic of the selflessness that had originally attracted Charlotte to him and which had been maintained despite everything he had endured. But the final paragraphs of this letter had contained a warning and a request that had been more urgent than all the romantic sentiments that had preceded them, as Nathaniel had revealed that he had discovered that the conspirators were planning not just to silence Charlotte but to stage a dramatic incident that would discredit all of the evidence she had gathered while also serving as a warning to anyone else who might consider challenging their authority or exposing their crimes. They are planning something terrible, Nathaniel had written, something that will destroy you, while also sending a message to the entire community about what happens to people who threaten those in power. You must leave Camden immediately and seek protection from Marshal Barrett while he completes his investigation, because remaining there will only result in your death and the loss of everything we have worked to achieve." Charlotte's reading of this final warning had been accompanied by sounds from outside her house that had suggested Nathaniel's fears were well-founded and that the conspirators were indeed preparing to take action against her. The creak of footsteps on her porch and the soft scraping of someone testing her door locks had been followed by retreating sounds that had suggested the intruders had been checking her defenses and planning their approach rather than attempting an immediate attack. The decision about whether to follow Nathaniel's advice and flee to Portland immediately or to remain in Camden and wait for Marshal Barrett to complete his investigation had been complicated by Charlotte's understanding that leaving might appear to be an admission of guilt while remaining might cost her her life. The 10th and final letter had arrived 2 days later, delivered not at midnight as previous letters had been but rather during the afternoon by a frightened young boy who had thrust the envelope into Charlotte's hands and then run away before she could ask him any questions about who had sent him or what he knew about the letter's contents. The handwriting on this letter had not been Nathaniel's but rather belonged to someone whose identity was revealed in the opening lines as the prison guard who had been helping Nathaniel send his earlier correspondence despite the risks this assistance created for his own safety and well-being. "Mrs. Winslow," this letter had begun, "I write to inform you that Nathaniel Hart died last night after suffering from pneumonia that his weakened condition made impossible for him to overcome. He spent his final hours asking me to ensure that you received this message and to tell you that his last thoughts were of you and of his hope that the work you are doing together will succeed in bringing justice despite his inability to see that justice achieved. He also wanted you to know that your courage in acting on his letters has given meaning to his suffering and has made his imprisonment and death worthwhile because it will save others from the same fate that he and your late husband endured." The guard's letter had continued with additional details about Nathaniel's final days and his determination to maintain his fight against the conspiracy even when his physical condition had made writing impossible and when the discovery of his communication system had subjected him to additional punishments designed to break his spirit and force him to reveal the names of everyone who had been helping him. The description of Nathaniel's courage and dignity in the face of death had been both inspiring and devastating for Charlotte, confirming that the man she had loved had remained true to his principles until the very end while also forcing her to confront the reality that he was truly gone and that any hope she might have harbored about a future reunion had been lost forever. But the most important element of this final letter had been the guard's revelation about his own motivations for helping Nathaniel and his willingness to testify against the conspirators if given protection from retaliation. "I have watched these men destroy innocent lives for their own profit," the guard had written, "and I have been haunted by my participation in their crimes even though I told myself I was simply following orders and earning wages to support my family. Nathaniel's example has shown me that remaining silent about evil makes one complicit in that evil, and his death has convinced me that I can no longer serve men whose actions have no moral limits or human decency. I am prepared to provide testimony about everything I have witnessed during my years working at their prison, including details about other murders they have committed and evidence about the full extent of their criminal enterprise." The guard's offer to testify had been accompanied by a request that Charlotte help him make contact with Marshal Barrett and arrange for protection that would allow him to provide information without fear of being killed before he could complete his testimony. The description of what this guard knew about the conspiracy's activities and the documentary evidence he could provide about crimes that had been committed had suggested that his testimony could be even more valuable than the materials Charlotte had already gathered, potentially providing the kind of eyewitness accounts and insider knowledge that would be necessary to secure convictions in court proceedings where the defendants would have access to skilled lawyers and would attempt to discredit evidence that was based solely on documents that might be challenged as forgeries or misinterpretations. Charlotte's decision about how to respond to this offer had been complicated by her grief over Nathaniel's death and her awareness that working with this guard would require her to trust someone who had been complicit in her lover's imprisonment and suffering for years. The moral complexity of accepting help from someone whose own hands were stained with innocent blood had been difficult to reconcile with her desire for justice and her commitment to completing the work that both Nathaniel and Thomas had died trying to achieve. The practical necessity of obtaining this guard's testimony had eventually overcome her emotional reluctance to associate with someone who bore responsibility for crimes that had harmed people she loved. The meeting between Charlotte and the guard, whose name was revealed as Jacob Miller, had taken place in Portland under Marshal Barrett's supervision, with security measures in place to protect all participants from potential retaliation by conspirators who would certainly be monitoring their activities and looking for opportunities to prevent damaging testimony from being given. Miller's appearance had been that of a man who was carrying enormous guilt about his past actions while also feeling relief at finally being able to unburden himself of secrets that had been poisoning his conscience for years. "Mrs. Winslow," Miller had said during their first conversation, with obvious difficulty in meeting her eyes directly, "I cannot ask you to forgive me for my role in Mr. Hart's suffering or in the deaths of others who were confined in that terrible place. I can only tell you that I am prepared to do whatever is necessary to help bring these men to justice and to honor Mr. Hart's memory by completing the work he started. He spoke of you constantly during his imprisonment, and he maintained faith in your love and courage even when his own situation seemed hopeless. His final request was that I should tell you that loving you was the greatest blessing of his life and that he died believing that your work together would ultimately triumph over the evil that had destroyed your chance for happiness." Charlotte's emotional response to hearing these final words from Nathaniel had been overwhelming, requiring her to take several minutes to compose herself before she could continue the conversation about practical matters that needed to be addressed if justice was to be achieved and Nathaniel's death was to have the meaning he had hoped for. The realization that she had been loved so completely and faithfully by someone who had endured years of suffering while maintaining hope that their work together would succeed had been both painful and strengthening, confirming that the risks she was taking were worthwhile and that pursuing justice was the best way to honor both Nathaniel's memory and Thomas's sacrifice. As I think about Charlotte discovering that both the men in her life had been heroes fighting the same battle, one she thought was her husband and one she thought was her lost love, I'm struck by how often we don't recognize the courage of those closest to us until it's too late to thank them. Thomas died protecting her, Nathaniel died trying to save others, and Charlotte became the voice for both of them when their own voices were silenced. Her story reminds us that sometimes our most important work is carrying forward the missions of those who came before us, speaking truths that others died trying to reveal. Have you ever discovered something about someone after they were gone that completely changed how you understood them? Have you found yourself carrying on someone else's unfinished work because you knew they would have wanted you to complete what they started? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below, and if you have suggestions for other historical accounts of people who fought corruption and paid the ultimate price, please share those too. These conversations help us all understand that courage comes in many forms and that justice is often achieved by ordinary people who simply refuse to stay silent when silence would be safer. Winter bled into early spring in Camden, but the thaw brought little comfort, only muddy streets, sleet, and a mounting tension that made every glance, every hesitant knock, feel like the prelude to disaster. After Nathaniel's death, Charlotte became the undeniable centerpiece of a town rumor mill spinning faster than ever, as news of a federal investigation and unexpected visitors from Portland stoked both fear and suspicion among those loyal to the old regime. Yet, in the quiet of her home, surrounded by bundles of Nathaniel's and Thomas's letters, Charlotte gathered the last dregs of courage she would ever need. Marshal Barrett's men had set up a discreet watch near her property. Jacob Miller was now under protection, and formal charges against Camden's most powerful citizens had been filed, on bribery, insurance fraud, murder, and unlawful imprisonment. The first open strike came not from outsiders, but from within the town council itself, a committee of elders calling Charlotte to publicly account for her accusations. "You threaten the dignity of this community and the memory of your own husband," the chairman sneered, his lined face a mask of righteous anger. "Will you persist in these claims when you know they will destroy reputations and livelihoods?" Charlotte met his gaze, her voice steady but full of pain. "It was your secrets and your greed that destroyed those things, not my truth. I will not remain silent so you can continue to build your future on broken lives." The men accused, Hutchins, the harbor master Fleet, and the merchant Caldwell, hurled their denials before the gathering. Anger flared in the assembly hall, some questioning Charlotte's sanity, others hinting at scandal. But then Marshal Barrett appeared with court orders and evidence in hand, and Jacob Miller's shaken testimony, delivered through tears and long silences, brought a hush over the hall like none had ever heard. He recounted the island lighthouse, Thomas's doomed visit, the bribes, the deaths, and the letters. "I saw how hope survives in darkness," he said, "because Nathaniel refused to stop writing. He believed someone would listen. No soul in that packed room could claim true innocence bystanders, for in small towns silence too often becomes the accomplice of evil." As confusion and fear swept the council, one by one, widows and boatmen, young wives, and aging fishermen rose up and told what they'd always wondered, what they'd half known but been too afraid to voice. It was a tidal wave of small truths, breaking the great wall of deceit the old order had built. The power the conspirators had wielded for decades began to falter, not simply because of the papers Nathaniel had smuggled out or Charlotte's unwavering resolve, but because her courage made it possible for others to stop hiding. By midday, Marshal Barrett had more statements and witnesses than he dared hope. The leaders of Camden who had once sneered at Charlotte now fought amongst themselves, turning suspicion and blame every direction but their own. The townspeople watched with a mixture of shame and awe as old secrets were dragged into the light, shipwrecks explained, bribes uncovered, even deaths re-examined with a new understanding of what it meant to look away when injustice offered you a quiet life in exchange for your soul. Now, dear listener, before we proceed to the next and turning chapter, I want to pause. When someone has the courage to break a town's silence, they rarely do it for recognition. They do it for those who can't speak, for the ones they've lost, or for the children who deserve a better world. If Charlotte's story or her fight for truth moves you, let your presence be known in the community we are building here. Leave a comment with your perspective, your hopes, your pain, and share this story, because every voice of support makes others braver, too. And if you feel what Charlotte did, consider joining us as a subscriber. In a world where speaking up comes at a cost, let's promise each other to never sit silent when we can help another see the truth. The trial began in the late spring of 1841, when apple blossoms filled the air of Portland's federal courthouse and the weight of a nation's attention settled on proceedings that had captured the imagination of newspapers from Boston to Baltimore, who sent correspondents to witness what was being called the most significant corruption case in New England history. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity every day, with Camden residents who had traveled to witness the downfall of men who had ruled their town like feudal lords, journalists who scribbled furiously in their notebooks, and legal scholars who recognized that the outcome of this trial would establish precedents about accountability and justice that would echo for generations. Charlotte sat in the witness gallery, her dark mourning dress a stark contrast to the elaborate finery worn by the wives of the accused men who had also come to witness the proceedings, though their expressions revealed far less confidence than their expensive clothing might have suggested. The physical toll of the past year showed in Charlotte's face, which had aged beyond her 37 years through stress and grief, But there was also a strength and determination in her bearing that commanded respect even from those who had initially dismissed her accusations as the ravings of an unstable widow seeking attention or revenge for imagined wrongs. The prosecution's case had been built on the foundation that Charlotte, Thomas, and Nathaniel had constructed through years of patient investigation and document gathering, supplemented by Jacob Miller's testimony and the additional evidence that Marshal Barrett's team had uncovered during their own inquiries into maritime corruption along the Maine coast. The lead prosecutor, a federal attorney named Samuel Richardson who had built his reputation on taking on powerful interests that had been considered untouchable, understood that winning convictions would require more than simply presenting documents and testimony. It would require telling a story that jury members could understand and that would overcome their natural reluctance to believe that respected community leaders could have committed crimes so cold-blooded and systematic. Gentlemen of the jury, Richardson had begun in his opening statement, "You will hear during this trial about a conspiracy so vast and so cruel that you may find it difficult to believe such evil could exist in a civilized society. You will hear how these defendants, men who presented themselves as pillars of their community, who sat in church pews and served on civic committees, systematically destroyed lives and enriched themselves through fraud, bribery, and murder. You will hear from witnesses who saw these crimes committed, from widows who lost their husbands to deliberately caused maritime disasters, and from a woman who risked everything to expose corruption after receiving letters from a man who died in an illegal prison maintained by these defendants to silence anyone who threatened their criminal enterprise." The defense attorneys, who included some of the most skilled and expensive lawyers in New England, had attempted to characterize the prosecution's case as the product of personal grudges, misunderstandings about legitimate business practices, and the unreliable testimony of people whose own criminal participation made them unworthy of belief. Their strategy had been to acknowledge that some questionable activities might have occurred while arguing that these were isolated incidents rather than evidence of systematic conspiracy, and that the defendants had been unaware of any wrongdoing by subordinates who might have acted without authorization or oversight. Charlotte's testimony had been scheduled for the second week of the trial, allowing her time to observe how other witnesses were treated and to prepare herself for the cross-examination that she knew would be brutal as defense attorneys attempted to discredit her character and motivations. The night before she was scheduled to take the stand, Charlotte had read through all of Nathaniel's letters one final time, drawing strength from his words and reminding herself that she was speaking not only for herself but for everyone who had been victimized by men whose power had made them believe they were above the law and beyond consequences. The morning Charlotte took the witness stand, the courtroom had been so crowded that people stood in the aisles and pressed against the walls, creating an atmosphere of tension and anticipation that made it clear everyone understood the significance of her testimony. Marshal Barrett had positioned himself where Charlotte could see him if she needed encouragement, while Jacob Miller sat in the witness gallery with an expression that suggested he was praying for her strength and courage. "Mrs. Winslow," Prosecutor Richardson had begun gently, "please tell the court how you first became aware of the crimes committed by these defendants." Charlotte's voice had been quiet but clear as she had described the midnight delivery of the first letter and her initial confusion about its source and purpose, progressing through her gradual understanding of what Nathaniel was revealing and her decision to act on his information despite the dangers this created for her safety and reputation. The presentation of Nathaniel's letters as evidence had been a turning point in the trial, as Richardson had read selected passages aloud to demonstrate both the specificity of the accusations and the courage of the man who had written them while imprisoned under conditions designed to break his spirit and silence his voice. The jury members had leaned forward to hear every word, their expressions revealing shock and disgust as they had listened to descriptions of deliberate shipwrecks, fraudulent insurance claims, bribery of officials, and the maintenance of an illegal prison where people were confined without trial or hope of release. Charlotte's description of her midnight missions to gather documentary evidence had been accompanied by presentation of the actual materials she had recovered, with expert witnesses providing context about what these documents proved regarding systematic fraud and embezzlement. The ledgers from the merchant's warehouse had been particularly damning, containing explicit discussions of plans to cause maritime disasters and calculations of expected profits from the sale of salvaged cargoes that were supposed to have been lost at sea. The most emotional portion of Charlotte's testimony had come when Richardson had asked her to explain how she had learned that Thomas had been murdered rather than killed in an accident, and how this revelation had connected to Nathaniel's imprisonment and eventual death. Charlotte's voice had broken as she had described reading Nathaniel's account of Thomas's visit to the island prison and his promise to complete the investigation that had ultimately cost him his life, while jury members had openly wept at her description of how both men had died trying to expose corruption that had been protected by a conspiracy of silence. Mrs. Winslow, Richardson had asked during a particularly difficult moment, "Why did you choose to continue this fight after learning that it had already cost the lives of two men you loved? Why not simply take the evidence you had gathered and leave Camden, protecting yourself from men who had proven their willingness to commit murder to preserve their secrets?" Charlotte's answer had been simple but powerful, because remaining silent would have made their deaths meaningless, and because I knew that if I did not speak, these men would continue to harm others who had no way to protect themselves from predators who operated behind masks of respectability and civic virtue. The cross-examination by defense attorneys had been aggressive and personal, attempting to suggest that Charlotte's relationship with Nathaniel had been improper and that her accusations were motivated by romantic obsession rather than legitimate concern about criminal activity. These attacks had been countered by Richardson's objections and by the obvious respect that Charlotte commanded from jury members who recognized genuine courage when they witnessed it, but the defense had succeeded in creating enough confusion about timelines and motivations that the outcome of the trial had remained uncertain despite the strength of the documentary evidence and witness testimony. Jacob Miller's testimony had provided crucial corroboration of Charlotte's account, as he had described in horrifying detail the conditions in the island prison and the treatment of prisoners who had been confined there without legal process or hope of rescue. His description of Nathaniel's final days and his account of the conversations he had overheard between guards about plans to eliminate Charlotte before she could testify had been delivered with obvious remorse and guilt that had made it clear he was not someone seeking to avoid responsibility for his own actions but rather someone determined to ensure that greater criminals faced appropriate consequences. "I was a coward," Miller had testified, his voice shaking with emotion, "who told myself that following orders and collecting wages was sufficient excuse for participating in evil. Mr. Hart showed me through his example that true courage means standing for what is right even when doing so costs you everything, and his death has convinced me that I cannot go to my own grave without trying to make amends for the harm I helped these men inflict on innocent people whose only crimes were threatening to expose corruption that enriched the powerful at the expense of ordinary citizens." The defense's attempts to discredit Miller's testimony by pointing out his own criminal participation had been countered by his obvious willingness to accept responsibility for his actions and by the detailed knowledge he possessed about the conspiracy's operations that could only have come from someone with direct involvement and access to information that the defendants had attempted to keep secret. The jury's reaction to Miller's testimony had suggested that they found him credible despite his admission of guilt, recognizing that his cooperation was essential for bringing more serious criminals to justice. The final week of the trial had featured expert witnesses who had analyzed the documentary evidence and testified about standard business practices, making it clear that the financial irregularities and suspicious transactions documented in the materials Charlotte had gathered were not innocent mistakes or legitimate business activities but rather systematic fraud designed to enrich the defendants while creating the appearance of normal commercial operations. These expert witnesses had demolished defense arguments about misunderstandings or alternative interpretations of the evidence, establishing beyond reasonable doubt that the defendants had been engaged in criminal conspiracy. The closing arguments had been delivered over 2 days, with defense attorneys making final attempts to create doubt about the prosecution's case while Richardson had summarized the mountain of evidence and testimony that proved not only individual crimes but a pattern of systematic corruption that had operated for years with the complicity of men who had believed their social position and political connections made them immune from accountability. His final appeal to the jury had been powerful and moving, asking them to consider what kind of society they wanted to live in and whether justice would be reserved only for ordinary citizens while the powerful escaped consequences for even the most serious crimes. Gentlemen, Richardson had concluded, you have heard evidence that would convince any reasonable person that these defendants committed crimes that destroyed lives and betrayed the trust placed in them by their community. You have heard from witnesses who risked everything to tell you the truth, including a woman who lost both her husband and the man she loved to a conspiracy that killed to protect its secrets. You have seen documents that prove beyond any doubt that these crimes occurred and that these defendants were responsible for them. The question before you is not whether crimes were committed, but whether you have the courage to hold powerful men accountable for their actions, or whether you will send a message that wealth and position provide immunity from the laws that govern everyone else. The jury had deliberated for 3 days, a period during which Charlotte had remained in Portland under Marshal Barrett's protection while rumors circulated about disagreements among jury members and possible attempts by the defendants' allies to influence the outcome through intimidation or bribery. The tension during this period had been almost unbearable, as Charlotte had understood that an acquittal would not only free guilty men but would also put her own life at risk by demonstrating that the conspiracy had survived despite her efforts to expose it. The verdict, when it finally came, had been overwhelming and complete, with guilty findings on virtually every charge against all 3 principal defendants. The reading of the verdict had been accompanied by gasps and then cheers from spectators who had packed the courtroom to witness justice finally being served, while the defendants had sat in stunned silence as they had realized that their power and influence had not been sufficient to escape accountability for crimes that had been proven beyond any reasonable doubt. The sentencing had been severe, with prison terms that would ensure none of the convicted men would ever again be in position to harm others, while the financial penalties had been substantial enough to provide compensation for victims and to send a message that crime did not pay regardless of how sophisticated the schemes or how powerful the criminals. The judge's comments during sentencing had acknowledged the courage of Charlotte, Thomas, and Nathaniel in fighting corruption despite terrible personal costs, while also expressing hope that their example would inspire others to stand against injustice rather than accepting evil as an inevitable part of society. The aftermath of the trial had included additional prosecutions of lesser conspirators who had been identified through testimony and documents, creating a wave of accountability that had swept through Camden and other coastal towns where similar corruption had been operating, with the assumption that no one would have the courage or resources to challenge established power structures. The social and political impact of these prosecutions had been profound, leading to reforms in maritime regulation, banking oversight, and criminal justice procedures that were designed to prevent future conspiracies from operating with the impunity that had allowed the Camden network to destroy so many lives. Charlotte's return to Camden after the trial had been bittersweet, as she had been greeted as a hero by some residents while others had remained resentful about the exposure of crimes that had enriched their town and had provided employment and prosperity at the cost of lives that had been sacrificed to maintain a corrupt system. The house on High Street had no longer felt like home after everything that had happened, and Charlotte had made the decision to sell it and to leave Camden permanently, understanding that rebuilding her life would be easier in a place where she was not constantly reminded of everything she had lost. The memorial that Charlotte had established in Portland for Thomas and Nathaniel had been funded by restitution payments from the convicted conspirators and had served multiple purposes, providing a physical reminder of the cost of corruption while also supporting a school where young people could learn about civic responsibility and the importance of standing for truth even when doing so required personal sacrifice. The inscription on the memorial had been simple but powerful, "To Thomas Winslow and Nathaniel Hart, who proved that one person speaking truth can be more powerful than all the forces of corruption and evil when that truth is spoken with courage and love." Charlotte's later years had been spent in quiet work supporting reforms and helping other people who faced challenges similar to those that had nearly destroyed her, using her experience and the credibility she had earned through her courage to advocate for changes in laws and policies that would make it more difficult for powerful interests to victimize vulnerable people. Her correspondence with other women who had lost loved ones to corruption or who were fighting their own battles against injustice had been preserved and had provided insight into how her experience had shaped her understanding of the broader struggle for accountability and justice in a society that too often allowed wealth and power to shield criminals from consequences. The publication of Nathaniel's letters as a book had been Charlotte's final major project, completed shortly before her death at age 64 after a life that had been marked by both terrible tragedy and remarkable triumph. The book had included not only the letters themselves but also Charlotte's commentary providing context about the crimes they exposed and the investigation they had enabled, creating a permanent record of how ordinary people's courage could challenge and ultimately defeat corruption that had seemed invincible. The book's dedication had been simple: "To my beloved Nathaniel and my courageous Thomas, who taught me that love sometimes means fighting for justice that benefits strangers more than ourselves, and that the greatest legacy we can leave is a world where truth is stronger than the forces that would silence it." As I sit here in my preservation office, holding these letters that have survived over a century and a half sealed in black wax and wrapped in oilcloth, I find myself thinking about the extraordinary courage it must have taken for Charlotte to keep going when everyone she loved had been taken from her, when her own community turned against her, when powerful men plotted her death. The letters I discovered in that old sea captain's trunk weren't just historical documents, they were proof that love never truly dies when it's built on truth, and that one person speaking with absolute conviction can topple empires built on lies. Charlotte Winslow lived another 27 years after the trial that brought justice for Thomas and Nathaniel. She never remarried, though several men courted her after her story became known throughout New England. She told a friend in one of her later letters that she had been blessed to know two great loves in one lifetime, and that seemed enough for any mortal woman. Thomas had given her security and ultimately his life. Nathaniel had given her purpose and a cause worth fighting for. Both had taught her that love wasn't about possession or happiness, but about sacrifice and truth. The school she founded in Portland, which still stands today as the Hart Winslow Academy for Civic Justice, educated generations of young people in the principles that had guided her own transformation from a sheltered widow into one of the most effective advocates for legal reform in 19th century America. The curriculum included not only traditional subjects but also instruction in ethics, civic responsibility, and the courage required to stand against corruption even when doing so carried terrible personal costs. Students studied the actual letters that Nathaniel had written from his island prison, learning how words carefully chosen and bravely spoken could become weapons more powerful than any physical force. Charlotte's advocacy work had extended far beyond the specific case that had brought her into public life, as she had become a sought-after speaker and consultant on issues related to maritime regulation, banking oversight, prison reform, and women's rights to participate fully in legal proceedings and property ownership. Her testimony before legislative committees had been instrumental in passing laws that provided better protection for widows and other vulnerable people who might otherwise become victims of financial predators, while her writing on the importance of accountability for those in positions of trust had influenced legal thinking throughout the country. The publication of Nathaniel's letters in 1859 had been a sensation that had brought renewed attention to the Camden conspiracy case, while also establishing Charlotte as a literary figure whose work was studied by scholars interested in understanding how social reform movements developed and how individual courage could inspire broader change. The book had included not only the 10 original letters but also correspondence between Charlotte and Thomas that had been discovered after her return to Camden, revealing that her late husband had been investigating the conspiracy for years before his murder and had been planning to expose it when the conspirators had arranged the storm that had supposedly taken his life. The most controversial portion of the published letters had been Charlotte's own editions, where she had written about her relationship with Nathaniel and her complex feelings about a marriage to Thomas that had been arranged by her family but which had ultimately proven to be based on deeper mutual respect and shared values than she had recognized during their years together. Her honest discussion of loving two men in different ways and for different reasons had scandalized some readers while inspiring others who recognized the authenticity of her struggle to honor both relationships while also maintaining her commitment to truth regardless of how uncomfortable that truth might be. Charlotte's final years had been spent in Portland, where she had maintained a modest apartment near the waterfront and had continued her advocacy work even as age and declining health had limited her ability to travel and speak publicly. She had been cared for during this period by a young woman named Sarah Miller, daughter of Jacob Miller, who had testified at the trial and who had died several years later, still carrying the burden of guilt for his participation in the conspiracy despite his eventual cooperation with authorities. Sarah had been only a child during the trial but had grown up hearing her father's stories about Nathaniel's courage and Charlotte's determination, developing a deep admiration for the woman who had risked everything to achieve justice. The memorial service held for Charlotte after her death in 1867 had been attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by her work, including many who had never met her personally but who recognized that her courage had made it possible for them to challenge corruption and injustice in their own communities. The eulogies delivered at this service had emphasized not only her accomplishments but also her essential humanity, her ability to maintain compassion and hope even after experiencing devastating losses, and her unwavering belief that ordinary people possessed the power to create extraordinary change when they refused to accept evil as inevitable. The gravestone that marked Charlotte's final resting place had been inscribed with words from the last letter Nathaniel had written before his death, words that Charlotte had requested be used to summarize her own life and values. Love is not measured by years together but by willingness to sacrifice for another's good, and the greatest love is that which speaks truth even when silence would be safer. She had been buried between two empty graves marked with headstones bearing the names of Thomas Winslow and Nathaniel Hart, creating a permanent symbol of the bonds that had connected three people whose lives had been intertwined by love, tragedy, and shared commitment to justice. The legacy that Charlotte had created through her courage and determination had extended far beyond the specific reforms and institutional changes that had resulted from the Camden conspiracy trial. Her example had inspired countless other people who faced their own struggles against corruption and injustice, providing proof that individuals could make a difference even when confronting powerful interests that seemed invincible. The letters she had preserved and published had become primary source materials for historians studying how social change occurred and how ordinary people's moral courage could challenge and ultimately transform systems that had seemed permanent and unchangeable. The restoration of Nathaniel's reputation had been one of Charlotte's major achievements, as she had worked tirelessly to correct the false stories that had been spread about him and to ensure that his true character and accomplishments were recognized by people who had believed the lies manufactured by men whose crimes he had threatened to expose. The scholarship fund she had established in his name had provided educational opportunities for young people who possessed Nathaniel's intelligence and idealism but who lacked the financial resources to pursue the kind of advanced education that might allow them to become forces for positive change in their communities. The annual commemoration that had been established to honor the anniversary of the trial's verdict had become an occasion for reflecting on themes of justice, accountability, and individual responsibility that remained relevant long after the specific events that had inspired it had faded into history. Speakers at these commemorations had included judges, legal scholars, and reform advocates who had discussed how Charlotte's case had influenced the development of legal protections and how her example continued to provide inspiration for people fighting contemporary forms of corruption and abuse of power. The islands in Penobscot Bay where Nathaniel had been imprisoned had been acquired by the state after the trial and had been converted into a wildlife sanctuary, with a small museum on the former prison site that preserved the history of what had occurred there and served as a reminder about the importance of transparency and accountability in the justice system. Visitors to this museum could see reconstructions of the cells where prisoners had been held, read excerpts from Nathaniel's letters, and learn about the conspiracy that had been exposed through his courage and Charlotte's determination to ensure his suffering had not been meaningless. The transformation of Camden itself had been perhaps the most visible legacy of the trial and its aftermath, as the exposure of corruption had led to a complete restructuring of the town's governance and business practices. The new generation of leaders who had emerged after the convicted conspirators had been removed from power had been committed to transparency and ethical conduct, creating a community culture that valued honesty over expedience and accountability over loyalty to powerful interests. Camden had become known throughout Maine as a place where corruption would not be tolerated and where citizens possessed both the knowledge and the courage to challenge authority when necessary to protect justice. As I carefully return these precious letters to their protective case, preparing them for permanent display in the museum where they can inspire future generations, I find myself profoundly moved by what Charlotte, Thomas, and Nathaniel accomplished together despite never having the chance to work side by side or to know that their individual efforts would ultimately combine to create something far greater than any of them could have achieved alone. Their story teaches us that love takes many forms, that courage can be found in unexpected places, and that truth spoken with conviction can survive any attempt to silence it. What strikes me most powerfully about Charlotte's journey is how she transformed personal tragedy into public purpose, using her grief as fuel for a fight that benefited people she would never meet and changed a society that had tried to destroy her. She could have remained silent, could have accepted the loss of both men she loved and retreated into the safety of anonymous widowhood. Instead, she chose to honor their memories by becoming the voice they could no longer use themselves, speaking truths that had cost them everything and refusing to let their sacrifices be in vain. The midnight letters that arrived at Charlotte's door sealed in black wax were not just messages from a man who loved her, they were weapons forged in darkness, smuggled past guards and across cold waters, written by trembling hands that refused to surrender even when hope seemed impossible. Nathaniel died before he could see justice achieved, but his words lived on through Charlotte's courage to speak them aloud, to demand they be heard, and to refuse to let the powerful bury truth along with the man who had devoted his life to revealing it. If Charlotte's story has moved you, if you recognize her struggle in your own battles against forces that seem too powerful to challenge, if you've ever had to choose between comfortable silence and dangerous truth, I want to hear from you. Your stories matter because they connect us across the centuries to people like Charlotte who proved that ordinary individuals possess extraordinary power when they refuse to look away from injustice. Have you ever discovered that someone you loved was fighting battles you knew nothing about? Have you found the courage to complete someone else's unfinished work because you knew they would have wanted you to carry on? Share your experiences in the comments below, Because these conversations help us all understand that we're never truly alone in fighting for what's right. And if you have suggestions for other historical stories about people who spoke truth to power despite terrible costs, please share those as well. I preserve these stories because they remind us that courage is not the absence of fear but the decision to act despite terror, that love is not measured in years together but in willingness to sacrifice for another's good, and that one person speaking truth can echo through generations long after their voice has been silenced. If Charlotte's journey from widow to warrior, from victim to victor, from silence to the most powerful voice in New England has shown you that letters written in love can become weapons for justice, that death cannot silence truth when someone has the courage to speak it, and that ordinary people possess the power to bring down empires built on lies, please subscribe to hear more stories that prove grace conquers evil and truth always has the final word. I'm Eleanor, and I rescue these stories because they show us who we can become when circumstances demand more courage than we thought we possessed. Charlotte Winslow, Thomas Winslow, and Nathaniel Hart proved that love and truth are the most powerful forces in human experience, that sacrifice is never wasted when it serves justice, and that words carefully chosen and bravely spoken can change the world long after the voices that spoke them have fallen silent. Their legacy lives on in every person who chooses courage over comfort, truth over convenience, and justice over the safe silence that evil always demands. Thank you for being here, for listening to Charlotte's story, and for being part of a community that believes truth matters and that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they refuse to accept that injustice is inevitable. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to remember that their voice matters, that their courage can make a difference, and that love never dies when it's built on truth.